Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Center for Innovation in Campus Mental Health webinar series. So we're just going to take 1 or 2 minutes for our attendees to populate our list before we get started. All right, thank you for joining us today. The topic that we're going to be talking about is cannabis use guidelines and recommendations for Ontario's campuses. So just some housekeeping before we get started. Participants are on mute while we are on the call. You're in listen-only mode. We will be taking questions at the end of the webinar. So as the webinar is progressing, feel free to type in your questions using the question function on the menu, and we're going to start taking them up around 1:45. The webinar is being recorded and will be made available on our website. The presentation slides are also available to download if you click under handouts on the menu, and an email is also going to go out tomorrow with links to all of this. We do have a short survey at the end of the webinar, so please take a few minutes to complete it as the feedback is really important to us. Now I'm just going to introduce myself. My name is Perlin Ng. I am the Research and Knowledge Exchange Coordinator for the Center, and we are joined here today by Tamar Mayer from CAMH and Jean Hopkins from CICMH Ontario. Thank you for joining us today. So Jean is the Policy Analyst for the Canadian Mental Health Association Ontario Division, and Tamar is a Supervisor in the Provincial System Support Program's Knowledge Exchange team based at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health. So a little bit about the webinar today. For the past few months, our 3 organizations have been collaborating to produce a toolkit with the support from the Ministry of Advanced Education and Skills Development. This toolkit explores issues related to cannabis use and provides readers with an overview of health approaches that can reduce the harms and risk associated with it. The idea is that any campus professional, whether it's faculty, academic advisor, counselor, student service professional, anyone who's working with students who use cannabis will be able to refer to the guide for information. Also like to acknowledge that every post-secondary institution is different. They have unique strengths, circumstances, and needs. So for this reason, while the broad areas addressed in the guide are relevant to all institutions, it's not meant to be prescriptive or to serve as legal advice pertaining to cannabis use legislation. So your campus is going to be very different depending on where you are in Ontario, whether you are even in Ontario, because I realized that we have some guests who are also from out of province. So just take this as a general overview, a general guide, but it's not like a definite you must follow these steps. So the information in the guide was accurate at the time of its writing and is still accurate, but we're going to continue updating it as legislation comes out to reflect like current research and any other updates. The guide has 3 sections. The first section is going to give a better understanding of cannabis, the Ontario context, and the substance use spectrum. Section 2 is going to look at the reasons why students use or don't use cannabis, the effects of cannabis use on the brain in adolescents and young adults, and the link between cannabis use and mental health. The final section provides concrete steps for developing a campus-wide cannabis use framework to reduce harms if you don't already have such a framework. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Tamar to talk about the first section. Whoops, I completely missed the slide. My apologies. But now, Tamar, over to you.
Thanks so much, Perlin. And hello, everyone. It's great to see that there's so many attendees. Over 102 of you joined the session, which I think really points to the timeliness of this topic and that there's a lot of interest in ensuring that campuses across the province are taking an evidence-based approach when it comes to implementing harm reduction and public health policies and interventions with respect to cannabis. So as Perlin mentioned, my name is Tamar Mayer. I'm a supervisor within the Provincial System Support Program at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health. And I would just like to first just say what a tremendous opportunity it was to partner with CICMH Ontario, the Center for Innovation in Campus Mental Health, and the Ministry of Advanced Education and Skills Development to develop this guide. For those who don't know about PSSP at CAMH, so CAMH is Canada's leading mental health and addictions hospital. And PSSP is basically the provincial arm within CAMH. So we really work across the province really to move evidence to action to support the improvement of the mental health and addiction system to really ensure that Ontarians have the best mental health and addiction outcomes possible. We have offices across the province, and we work very closely with the Ministry of Health, but also have had great opportunities to work with the Ministry of Advanced Education, Advanced Education Skills Development, the Ministry of Education, and the Ministry of Child and Youth Services. And our program has skills and expertise with respect to knowledge exchange, equity engagement, and evaluation. So if you could just go to the next slide, Perlin. One of the initiatives that we have as PSSP within our knowledge exchange portfolio is called the Evidence Exchange Network. And EENet for short is really an online network that really helps to create and share evidence to build a better mental health and addiction system in Ontario. It's located in PSSP, and we have over 9,500 stakeholders, including clinicians, service providers, people with lived experience, family members, and policymakers. And you're more than welcome to check out some of the resources, along with the resources that are available both on the CMHA and the CICMH website. So about Section 1. So if you can go to the next slide, Section 1 of the resource. Perlin mentioned the 3 sections that we're discussing. Section 1, as you can see on the slide, provides an overview of cannabis within the Ontario context, as well as cannabis use prevalence in Ontario. Given that this is a new area for, this may be a new area for campus professionals in Ontario, the section is also intended to provide information about the substance use spectrum, an overview of the need to understand cannabis through a public health and harm reduction lens. So I'm just going to now briefly go on to the next slides to provide a little bit of an overview with respect to what you can find in this section, and do encourage you to go to the CICMH website where it's live now to find out more. So I'm not going to go into great detail about any of these sections, but it's really just an overview to provide some information about what's embedded within Section 1. So cannabis, as you know, is a psychoactive drug from the cannabis plant and contains cannabinoids which act on receptors in the brain to cause psychoactive or mind-altering effects. The main chemical compound in cannabis is THC, which is responsible for the mental and physical effects that follows cannabis use. Cannabis can be consumed by smoking it, vaporizing it, it can be added to food, or it could be used as an extract applied to skin. And we know that cannabis is not a benign substance. It does have health and social harms which increase with intensity of use. This is particularly the case when used frequently and when it's used at an early age. It can be associated with increased risk of problems with cognitive and psychomotor functioning, respiratory problems, dependence, and mental health problems. So on to the next slide. Cannabis, we know, is a favorite recreational drug of Canadians, along with alcohol and tobacco. Like those drugs, cannabis is associated with a variety of health and social harms. However, unlike those drugs, cannabis is currently illegal, prohibited under the same federal rules as heroin and cocaine. However, as you know, the landscape is changing. And the Cannabis Act was introduced in April 2017, and cannabis is on target to be legalized later in 2018, with timing confirmed by the Government of Canada. So when we look at cannabis use in Ontario, population health surveys like the Ontario Student Drug Use and Health Survey and the CAMH Monitor indicate that 14.5% of adults, this is in 2015, and 19% of grade 7 to 12 students, this is in 2017, reported using cannabis in the past year. The slide that you see, the graph that you see on the slide here, is from the Ontario Student Drug Use and Health Survey. And I want you to pay special attention to the black arrow pointing to the grade 12 prevalence rates of past year cannabis use. So you can see from grade 7 to grade 12, there's a statistically significant increase in the rates of cannabis use in terms of past year reported use by students, with the peak in grade 12. So we know that grade 12 students are using cannabis, reporting past year cannabis use at 37%. What you'll notice, though, is across grades 7 to 12, there's no statistically significant difference in gender. So male and female students are using cannabis in the past year equally the same. And on the far right of the graph, you can see that there's no statistically significant difference in the geographical variation of cannabis use across the province. So GTA, the North, West, and East are all using, students that is, reported past year cannabis use equally. If you go to the next slide, we do have the opportunity to look a little bit more closely at post-secondary students. So the American College Health Association National College Health Assessment conducted an Ontario-specific survey in spring 2016 for the Ontario Canada Reference Group. This survey consisted of approximately 25,000 students from across Ontario. And what the survey found was that 19% of students reported using cannabis in the past 30 days preceding the survey, and 3% of students reported using cannabis almost daily. So this is very important information to know. Again, this was pre-legalization. We'll have to see whether the rates do change, and look forward to reviewing if there is a follow-up survey to this document to see in what way they do change amongst post-secondary students. On the next slide, we'll see a table from the same survey, and I really wanted to point this out because I think it shows some very interesting statistics with respect to actual use, as I mentioned, was 19%. But those students who reported, those 19% of students who reported past use 30-day use in the past 30 days, students perceived that their peers in the past 30 days, that 86% of their peers were using cannabis. So what we see is a really big discrepancy in terms of actual use and perceived use. And I think that's a very interesting thing to consider as we move forward with legalization in terms of actual versus perceived. On to the next slide, Perlin. One of the key goals, as I mentioned earlier about the section, was really to promote a shared and common understanding of some of the background on substance use, addiction, and public health and harm reduction approaches to cannabis. So what you see on this slide is that psychoactive substance use falls on a spectrum, ranging from abstinence all the way to having an addiction or a substance use disorder. And it's important to know that movement along the spectrum is not necessarily linear, that a person or an individual may use substances differently at different points in their life and due to different situations or challenges that arise. It's possible to apply interventions to minimize risks and harms all across this continuum of use. When we talk about problematic use, what we mean are when substances are used in a way that are associated with physical, psychological, economic, or social problems, or when use poses health or safety risks to the person and those around them. It's also important to note with respect to cannabis that some people use cannabis for medical reasons. The access to cannabis for medical purposes regulation permits medical use of cannabis when authorized and prescribed by a healthcare provider. And it's important to note that the legalization of cannabis will not change the rules and the processes for accessing cannabis for medical purposes. So on to the next slide. We introduced the importance of having understanding of a public health approach and why a public health approach for cannabis is really crucial. So a public health approach seeks to reduce the adverse health, social, and economic consequences of at-risk activities. It aims to promote the health of a whole population while still focusing on those populations at greater risk. It addresses risk and protective factors at an individual, family, community, and societal level, and responds with evidence-based services, programs, and policies. The strategies used in a public health approach include health promotion and protection, harm reduction, as well as evidence-based services to those people who have developed or at risk of developing a substance use problem. A public health approach to cannabis is critical and focuses on reorienting our approach to cannabis as a health issue and not a legal one. So again, more information will be available in the resource. And just to note that there are a lot of great references and documents that are also provided if you want some more information about any of these approaches. The next approach that we talk about in section 1 is a harm reduction approach on the next slide. And harm reduction is most commonly used in relation to public health programming with people who use psychoactive substances, but is also applied to programs and policies that address alcohol, sexual practice such as condom use, cycling, putting on a bike helmet, and driving, for example, using a seatbelt. These are all harm reduction approaches. And as Jean is going to talk about a little bit more, there are some really great tools and resources such as Canada's lower risk cannabis use guidelines that provide harm reduction approach to cannabis. Fundamentally, harm reduction focuses on reducing negative consequences associated with drug use and supporting safer use for the health and safety of all individuals, family, and communities. And finally, the last concept that we address in section 1 is providing and presenting a conceptual model of cannabis policies. As you can see from this slide, it illustrates from how total prohibition on the left-hand side to unregulated legalization on the other side can result in similarly severe health and social harms. Our current system, so pre-legalization, can be described as prohibition. That's where the use and possession of cannabis is punishable by law. And we know that there have been certain populations that have experienced the unjust persecution as a consequence of cannabis prohibition. Decriminalization involves removing possession of small amounts of cannabis from the sphere of criminal law and instead making them civil violations punishable by a fine. Next is legalization, which removes all penalties for cannabis possession and use by adults. As we move forward with legalization and it becomes more and more clear, what we are looking at is in Ontario is a system of legalization with regulation, and it's really a public health approach to reducing harms in the population. So that's the overview of section 1. I'll turn it over to Jean now to carry on with section 2.
Tamar. So as mentioned, my name is Jean Hopkins and I'm a policy analyst with the Canadian Mental Health Association, the Ontario Division, and we're a nonprofit charitable organization committed to making mental health possible for all. We have 30 local branches across the province that offer a wide range of services, and today I'm going to speak to section 2 of this guide. And in this section, we really wanted to take a look at some of the issues that might emerge with cannabis use on campus and assist campus professionals in providing information to students about some of the risks and what strategies can be used, so including harm reduction. So we wanted to look at some of the reasons why students use cannabis and why some do not, to provide information and evidence about the potential risks, so specifically looking at some of the physical and mental health risks, impaired driving, and providing information about harm reduction. Discuss issues related to stigma and how this can be reduced through the language that we use with students, and suggestions for ways of engaging with students as well. So finally, we wanted to also look to the lower risk cannabis use guidelines, as Tamar mentioned earlier, and I'm going to speak a little bit to that later. But throughout this guide, we also really wanted to focus on special populations that might be at higher risk of some of the harms related to cannabis consumption. So specifically looking at youth and people who use cannabis frequently. So on this slide, you'll see some of the key points that are in this section. And as we know, as previously mentioned, cannabis is a widely used substance, and we know that there's consistent evidence that links frequent early onset cannabis use with negative effects, including mental health problems. So about 33% of Canadians aged 15 and older who use cannabis in the past 3 months reported that they consume daily or almost daily. And it's also important to recognize that much of the research that currently exists regarding mental health and the links to cannabis do not have sufficient evidence to make the direct causal link between cannabis use and mental illness. However, frequent cannabis use, especially in adolescents, is an identified risk factor for mental illness, including psychosis, and especially if there is a personal or family history as well. For young adults who have psychosis, ongoing cannabis use can worsen symptoms over the long term, and symptoms such as depression, insomnia, anxiety, and disturbances in appetite were reported by some cannabis users in the context of withdrawal from high frequency use. And so that's also similar to withdrawal symptoms that are seen with the frequent use or the problematic use of other psychoactive substances as well. So we know that cannabis use, especially if it's early onset, if it's frequent, is not without risks, and a campus approach that provides education, health promotion, and harm reduction strategies can assist in minimizing some of those potential harms. And in addition to that, having access to accurate information about the risks and benefits of cannabis can assist students in making informed decisions about their substance use. So having access to information as well as psychosocial campus supports can also support in developing protective factors as well. So in this slide, you'll see some of the factors that can potentially increase risks, such as stressful life events, lack of connection to a community. And these risk factors can result in negative health effects, including an increased risk of developing substance use problems as well. So on the other hand, protective factors such as education and supportive relationships can have positive impacts on a person's health and mitigate the risk of mental health concerns. So while this chart is really not a comprehensive list, and we go into more detail within the guide as well, it provides an overview of some of the key risks and protective factors, and also the roles that campuses can play in enhancing protective factors for students. So in this section, we also look to some of the issues surrounding stigma and the importance of language as well. So by choosing to use non-stigmatizing language, students who are experiencing challenges might face fewer barriers in accessing support. So in addition to this, it can also break down negative stereotypes associated with substance use, and students might feel more comfortable engaging around issues of substance use, asking questions, or identifying when they might benefit from more comprehensive supports on campus as well. So it's recommended to use language that's neutral, that's precise, that's medically accurate, and also to use people-first language that focuses on the individual and not necessarily on the action. So for example, instead of drug addict or abuser, there's less judgment in the term person who uses drugs or person who uses drugs problematically. And research shows that stigma is one of the largest barriers to accessing treatment for problematic substance use. So that the language that we use is a really important consideration for campus service providers. And in addition to that, we also wanted to provide information about some potential ways to engage with students as well. So legalization really provides an opportunity for an open dialogue and for further education and for cannabis literacy among students as well. So it's important to ensure that students feel comfortable in discussing substance use. And we also recognize that this is sort of a brave new world for many people as well. And so many of these conversations might be very new for campus professionals. So we included some suggestions. So for example, stay open, objective, and non-judgmental when a student speaks about their substance use. Listen carefully and seriously when a student discusses either medical or non-medical cannabis for coping with specific symptoms. So for example, if a student identifies that they use cannabis for sleep or anxiety. Share accurate information and avoid lecturing. Be compassionate and curious about the student's perceptions and experiences with cannabis use. Educate yourself and use facts where you can. Match the language so that the student is using. So for example, if a student is using the term weed to discuss cannabis, do so as well. And that ensures that you're really meeting them where you're at and using language that they're also comfortable with. Don't assume that you know a student's experiences, feelings, or interest in cannabis. And I'd also add to this list too, informing yourself about campus support services if you don't already, to ensure that you know the appropriate places to direct students if they are looking for additional information or more comprehensive supports on campus. And we also wanted to provide information on harm reduction interventions within this section as well. And harm reduction interventions for wherever a student might be on the continuum, the substance use continuum that Tamar outlined in section 1. So for harm reduction interventions, we wanted to speak to the lower risk cannabis use guidelines. And in 2017, the Canadian Research Initiative on Substance Misuse, in partnership with CICMH, published the Lower Risk Cannabis Use Guidelines, which is an evidence-based public health intervention tool. So the LRCUGs provide 10 science-based recommendations on how to reduce the risks and the harms associated with cannabis for non-medical reasons. So I'll just go through them briefly. So number 1 is cannabis, the harms associated with cannabis use are best avoided by abstaining. So as with any risky behavior, the safest way to reduce those risks is to avoid that behavior altogether. The same is true for cannabis, but we also know that that's not necessarily realistic. So number 2 is delay taking up cannabis use until later in life. As discussed before, we know that there's an increased risk with earlier onset and frequent cannabis use. Identify and choose lower risk cannabis products. So this might include cannabis products that contain a higher CBD to THC ratio. Avoid the use of synthetic cannabinoids. And avoid smoking burnt cannabis. So although it's not risk-free, consider the possibility of choosing safer ways of consuming cannabis, so such as vaporizers or edibles. If you smoke cannabis, avoid harmful smoking practices such as deep inhalation or consuming cannabis with tobacco products. Limit and reduce how often you use cannabis. Don't use and drive or operate other machinery. So driving under the influence of substances, including cannabis, contributes to fatal road crashes. And we provide further information about this within the guide as well. It also looks at special risk populations. So as we mentioned before, there are some populations that are higher risk for cannabis-related adverse effects. So people who have a history of mental health concerns or family history of mental health concerns or substance use disorders, as well as pregnancy. And avoid combining these risks as it can amplify the potential harm. So we also included some additional harm reduction suggestions that are relevant to a campus context as well. And for the sake of time, I won't get into them too much, but I will add that an additional harm reduction measure would be also to ensure that students have an understanding of what the current laws are related to cannabis in Ontario. So that can include, the legal age, where you can purchase cannabis, where you can consume cannabis. And the transition to cannabis legalization is going to be complex, and there's bound to be misinformation, and ensuring that students know what the laws are can also be understood as a harm reduction strategy as well. So I know that this is something that Perlin's going to speak to a little bit further, so I'll hand it over to Perlin, and she can discuss section 3.
All right, thanks, Jane. I'm just going to shift this over so that people can see me talk. All right. Okay, so this section we're going to go into discussing how a campus can approach the development, implementation, and evaluation of a cannabis use framework that emphasizes lower risk and harm reduction. Every institution is different, and your campus may already be working on a framework or have recently implemented one. But if your institution is just starting to look at developing a framework, this section is going to offer some of the considerations to bear in mind. Keep in mind that this framework should be a part of a general substance use and mental health framework for your campus. And if your institution already has a framework and lower risk guidelines related to tobacco and alcohol use, they should be used to shape the framework for cannabis. So first things first, considerations for your campus. The strategy and the time that it's going to take to develop a cannabis use framework for your institution is going to depend on a variety of factors, including the prevalence of cannabis use at your institution, as well as the size and type of campus. So first off, the first thing to consider is your stakeholders. So who's on your campus? Development and implementation of this framework is going to be more effective if somebody within the campus champions the effort and helps to start the process with a goal, an objective, a timeline, and a directive to bring everyone together as a committee. This committee should consist of individuals who represent your institution's administration. So this could be your student union, faculty, health and well-being services, administration, campus security, frontline staff, residence life staff, and don't forget to also include community organizations, because these community organizations have considerable expertise when it comes to dealing with mental health and substance use. So, for example, public health units, the Canadian Centre on Substance Use and Addiction, and the Canadian Mental Health Association. Consultation with the student population throughout the process of development and implementation of this framework is also really important. So next, your campus climate. So the first step in developing the cannabis framework is going to be to examine your institution's policies regarding cannabis and compare them to those at other institutions. So as I mentioned before, some institutions might already have an existing framework or are working towards one. So you're going to want to talk to other institutions and kind of compare, see where you're at. Consider also using your own survey to gauge cannabis use. So we already have the survey that came out of the NCHA, but that was pre-legalization. So post-legalization, you might want to actually roll out another survey that's going to gauge prevalence and attitudes and beliefs about cannabis on your campus. And then what's also important is the incorporation of harm reduction lens, which is what we know we've been focusing on in this toolkit. So cannabis education design should also include student focus groups to ensure that the resulting policies and educations are going to be relevant to students. So for example, findings that there may be a lack of awareness of the negative effects of cannabis would point to the need for education about the health and legal consequences of using cannabis. Education should be one piece of a multifaceted approach to prevention. A lot of youth and students claim that lack of information about the positive effects of cannabis make the information about harmful effects appear overstated, leading them to disregard negative claims completely. So one option is to present a balanced approach that showcases the research on harms as well as the potential subjective benefits of cannabis, such as relaxation, stress reduction, etc. That has proven to be more persuasive. Students would also benefit from evidence and guidelines on how to reduce their risk of harm if they would use cannabis. So this points to the LCA blower risk. LRCUG. LRCUG, there we go. And finally, medical use. So it's important to bear in mind the whole medical and the distinction between medical use and non-medical use of cannabis. So your campus student and employer accommodation policies related to the use of cannabis for medical purposes should be revisited to see if they require any changes in relation to new legislation. Right, so the actual development of the framework. Things to consider are your campus culture and context. So things like timing of use. There is mounting evidence that specific events are associated with higher rates of student drinking cannabis use, such as Orientation Week, Halloween, Homecoming, St. Patrick's Day. So these are times during your academic calendar that you might want to ramp up education surrounding cannabis use. Prevalence of use. So different campuses and different student populations are going to have different rates of use. Once again, consider using that survey to determine where your campus is at. Champions on campus. What's really going to help to roll out education and harm reduction strategies is recruiting a member of the campus community who has experience with cannabis use, both positive and negative, and who is trusted by the student body to deliver education and harm reduction messaging. The second point is surrounding increasing personal confidence of staff and students to discuss problematic cannabis use. So here you really want to encourage an environment where people do feel safe to bring this up. So once again, going back to that harm reduction approach, and also building the capacity of staff. So providing staff such as faculty and resident advisors with evidence-informed tools and resources on cannabis is going to equip them to inform students. So how you can do that, for example, is directing them to this guide, because Section 1 and Section 2 has a lot of that information. And cultivate a sense of community. So promoting a spirit of openness and exchange is critical to community building to nurture a sense of connectedness and empathy so that students don't feel alienated and alone, so that they can discuss issues that they're facing if they want to. And finally, what's important is the academic and personal development of students. So providing students with tools to manage stress and mental health challenges is important. As discussed earlier in this guide, many students report using cannabis to manage their boredom, loneliness, stress, anger, and anxiety. For this reason, they do need alternative approaches to manage their negative emotions. Again, this speaks to the need to integrate this framework within the larger mental health framework on your campus in order to ensure that students are getting the support that they need in order to flourish. Another thing to consider is when you're developing your framework, obviously you want to consider the legislative framework on your campus. So first of all, minimum age, that is 19 and older in Ontario. And as for possession, possession of up to 30 grams of dried cannabis is legal. Cannabis is permitted, I wanted to say prohibited and become permitted. Is prohibited in all public places. It is permitted only in private residences, and campuses are going to be able to decide if on-campus student residences are going to be considered private residences or not. If a residence on campus allows consumption of non-medical cannabis, smoking and vaping of this cannabis will still be prohibited in all indoor common areas, including elevators, hallways, parking facilities, party rooms, etc., etc. It's only within the individual dorm rooms that are considered private. Enforcement. So the Smoke-Free Ontario Act does impose penalties for consumption of cannabis in public, and it is going to be up to your campus to decide if the penalties are going to be imposed. When it comes to the retail and distribution of cannabis, they're only supposed to be sold through the Ontario Cannabis Store, and the placement of these stores have been structured so that the proximity to whether it's the K-12 schools or post-secondary campuses is minimized. So you can use that link to go into the page from the Ontario website to actually look into more of the legal framework. And also on the guide itself, we're going to go into that in a lot more detail, just trying not to take up too much time here. And finally, when it comes to implementing and evaluating your framework, for a campus cannabis use framework to be implemented effectively, it must be the result of a process that involves as many partners as possible who are invested in its success. So there need to be mechanisms in place as well to monitor and respond to feedback throughout the process. Part of ensuring that the framework is effective is going to involve focusing on the safety and well-being of all your community members. To do this, you can implement evaluation frameworks that are probably going to be part of larger initiatives to evaluate your mental health frameworks as well. So for example, so here are some indicators of implementation success that you can refer to when thinking about evaluation. Adherence to the framework by students and staff, awareness of the framework components amongst campus constituents, perceptions of enforcement, rate of complaints, impact on cannabis use among different groups as an impact of the framework, whether or not the framework objectives have been met, and also the level of support for potential changes to the framework. So here are some additional references to a lot of the things that we've been covering in the guide. And now we're actually going to go to somebody who's going to provide a camper's perspective. Maria, do you want to say a couple of words first?
Yes, I am very happy.
You are in the shot. Yes.
Hi, everyone. My name is Maria Pudgeon, and I'm the Director for the Centre for Innovation in Campus Mental Health. And it is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker. We have Dominica Flood to provide us with the campus perspective. And Dominica is the Director of Strategic Initiatives and Partnerships at the Council of Ontario Universities. And we are also very lucky that she sits on the executive committee for the Centre. So thank you very much, Dom, for joining us today. And we are looking forward to hearing the campus perspective.
Great, thanks, Maria and all. I think a lot of what I say has already kind of been said, so maybe what I'll do is reiterate a few key points. Just at COU, as some background, we've actually had a working group on cannabis struck probably about 10 months ago now, and that's made up of environmental health and safety officers, senior human resource officers, legal counsel, student affairs, accessibility, and a few kind of other stragglers on who are very interested in the topic to start with. So we've been working on this file from the university perspective for some time, and I think one of the key things that I'd like to leave everybody with is that post-secondary institutions, by definition, are workplaces. So technically, consumption of cannabis on our campuses will be illegal. There are discussions within the university sectors, and I'm sure there are with the college sector, about residences. And the perspective that we are sort of taking right now is that, you know, it's a private residence. We're going to be working in terms of implementing substance use policies similar to the ones we do with alcohol and smoking. Most residences will be smoke-free. So at this point in time, we don't anticipate that, you know, there's going to be an uptick in smoking of cannabis within residence rooms. Now, that being said, I think we all recognize that consumption is already currently happening on campuses, and I don't think anyone would be surprised that, you know, it will continue and probably spike for a little bit. But the intention is that, you know, universities and colleges are workplaces, and therefore technically not legal to consume cannabis, but except for individual dorm rooms within residences. As Perlin mentioned earlier, any common areas, things like that, will be not smoke-free, but you will not be allowed to consume within those common areas. I think there's a lot of discussion happening within the post-secondary sector around what happens in terms of when edibles become legal within a year. Obviously, trying to police those is going to be extremely challenging, and I think institutions are going to need to think through, you know, things like someone is making pot brownies, for example, in a communal kitchen, and how do you take action when someone consumes something that they inadvertently, you know, was left behind by someone else and they don't know. So that, you know, these are considerations that everyone's going to have to start thinking through in terms of developing their own frameworks and substance use policies. But again, I think harm reduction is going to be the key and the way most institutions are going to approach this. And the one other big area that's kind of been coming up as a topic of discussion is in terms of growth. Legally, within Ontario, you're going to be allowed to grow 4 personal plants. I think a lot of institutions are right now saying that that will not be allowed within individual residences, and, you know, using things such as fire regulations and other things around that, you know, hydro and impacts of those things on the growing as their way out from allowing growth. But one campus may allow and one may not, so that's going to be an individual discussion. Finally, the third area that has come up for discussion within the campus community is around the idea of online distribution of cannabis. So we know that there's going to be cannabis stores, but there's also going to be online distribution. A number of the campuses have already been saying that online distribution will not be allowed. It's very difficult to ensure that cannabis being delivered through the mail is actually delivered to the correct person in a campus setting. So similar to services like Dial a Bottle or things like that that exist now, online distribution for a number of campuses will not be allowed. So it will be students having to go to a cannabis store to obtain cannabis. And I think the last point that I just wanted to mention as well, and Tamar said this earlier, but, you know, any and all frameworks and discussions and policies that we're talking about are strictly around recreational cannabis. Medicinal cannabis was still going to be accommodated in the way it has been currently accommodated. And as universities and colleges are looking at things like smoke-free campuses and other things, that those discussions will happen outside of the discussions around recreational cannabis. That's it.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Dom.
Great. Okay, so I guess now we're gonna move into Q&A.
And I think we just wanted to announce.
Oh,
Do you want to?
Yeah, so the toolkit is now currently live. The guide is live and is available at campusmentalhealth.ca. In addition to that, too, we also just wanted to say that this is a living document. There are currently, many things that could potentially change. So Bill C-45 right now, which is the federal cannabis law, the Cannabis Act, there might be some changes to that. It's currently in the Senate, and so we just wanted to acknowledge and recognize that this is really complex. And as new information emerges, this is going to be a document that shifts and changes to reflect that as well. Yeah, anything else, Ed?
And the other thing we would like to add just at the center is that as you'll see if you go through the guide, we are really asking campuses that are developing policies, that have developed policies, to share those with us if they're willing to share them with other campuses. What we are also hearing is that campuses are on sort of different areas of the spectrum in terms of preparation, what they've been able to develop. So if you are willing to share things, if you're willing to send those to us and are willing for us to share them with other campuses, please do so. And I think with that, we'll open it up for questions. Thank you, Perlin.
All right, so I think we have a bunch of questions already rolling in here. Let me just open it up. Oops. You know what? I am just going to open it up here. There we go. Okay, first question is, what is a synthetic cannabinoid?
Yeah, great question. And I mentioned it very briefly, but I didn't go into too much detail. So synthetic cannabis is a relatively new class of drug. It falls under new psychoactive substances. And it is designed and mimicked to recreate the effects of THC. That said, it can potentially have unpredictable side effects or more of a psychoactive impact, and there's a number of health risks that are involved with synthetic cannabis. It's also known as K2 or spice, so those are terms that it's often referred to as. I don't know if Tamar, if you had anything else you wanted to add there in terms of synthetic cannabis.
No, you hit it all, Jean.
Okay.
Okay, great, thank you. Next question is more of a logistical one. Will this webinar be recorded? Yes. Where will it be? So I'm going to send out a link tomorrow with link to the slides, link to the recording of the webinar, and also a link to our online community of practice where you can continue to ask questions. Okay, so the next question is, looking at the risk and protective factors slide, how is knowledge of and access to supports a risk factor? Just a correlation?
That's a good question.
We'll
just go back to the slide. I wonder if that might have been a typo, and if so, I apologize. Risk factor.
Oops.
Lack of access to the social determinants of health. Maybe there was a misunderstanding there. I'm not too sure. So risk factors and protective factors.
So maybe,
right.
Jane,
Yeah.
we might want to just interpret that as lack of knowledge of and access to supports.
I see. Okay.
Yeah, so that might have just been a typo in the slide.
Sure, okay. Yeah.
But definitely, I think knowledge and awareness of the range of supports that are available within a campus setting is definitely a protective factor.
Yes.
And I think it's really critical as we move forward to really build knowledge and awareness of the range of supports that are available to students across the campus setting, particularly for those who are new and especially international students who might not know how to access or be a little bit more uncomfortable with the system.
Yeah, great point. Yeah, and as mentioned before, this is sort of a condensed version of what is currently in the document as well.
The next question is tricky. Can you speak more to the hydro and fire regulations being used as support for not allowing growing cannabis in residence? So I am not sure about that. Dom, or Jean, or anyone opening this up?
Fire regulations being used as yeah, unfortunately, I can't speak to that in too much detail. Again, these are issues that are going to be emerging, and broader conversations are going to be happening about these specific details. And it's a great question, and certainly something that, as I mentioned before, this is going to be a living document that we can, keep track of and hopefully have an answer for you at some point.
And if we do hear of an answer, we will also obviously post it on our community of practice,
Absolutely.
which Pauline will give you details on.
Absolutely.
Maybe I can touch on that one a little bit because this came up at the COU working group with residents' life and health and safety officers that, the understanding is to properly grow cannabis. It takes, hydro, it takes other heat lamps and whatnot. I'm not an expert in this, but there is concern that if, all students within residences are all of a sudden growing 4 plants in every single dorm room, that there are risks in terms of hydro and, possible fire risks if there's heat lamps that are left on and things like that. I think the concern is it's a bit more than just having a regular house plant on your windowsill.
I see. Okay, makes sense. Yeah. Great, thank you. And the next question, the difference between actual use and perceived use is quite striking and suggests that there might be an opportunity to educate students on the actual use now and not just as normalized as we think. Are there any examples of campuses that might be doing something like this? Educations around actual versus perceived use.
Dom, have you heard of anyone doing such education?
Sorry, no, I haven't at this time, although I know that's something that we're really interested in terms of ensuring that students have more education as to, cannabis usage and its impacts, and the perceived one would probably be part of that.
And again, we can actually send that question out to a couple of our partners who've done some work in this. And if and when we have some responses, we'll make sure to put it on our community of practice as well. So we will collect that.
Yep.
That's the great thing about these questions. It allows us to do some searches for you as well.
Oh, someone actually just replied to that question, I believe. University of Toronto, Mississauga does some really cool stuff around that actually during their first year orientation. There we go.
That's great.
UTM. Okay, our next question is, any thoughts on how to protect students who will be now affected by the secondhand impact of others smoking cannabis?
Maybe I can touch on that quickly. I mean, most residences are I think all residences are smoke-free. A number of institutions are looking at going completely smoke-free campus-wide. So technically, there shouldn't be secondhand smoke impact because you're only going to be allowed to consume within your residence room, which is technically smoke-free under the law. Now, as I said earlier, this is already happening, so there are going to be instances where smoking will be an issue, but under the law, most residences, you won't be able to smoke it anyway.
If I could just jump in, I think, getting back to low-risk cannabis use guidelines, which are really promoting to not smoke burnt cannabis. We know that a lot of the harms related to cannabis use is from the carcinogens in terms of the burnt. So I think increasing awareness of using alternate forms, which are less harmful with respect to vaping, is really important in terms of creating awareness of strategies to reduce harm amongst the student population.
Yep. Great. Thanks, Tamar. Anything to add, Jean?
No, I think that's
great. The next question is, what happens when a student is prescribed cannabis and there is a placement component? So this sounds like it's medical use of cannabis. So I think this would fall under like your institution's like accommodations policies and like what that is aligned with, really. Yeah. Any other thoughts? Okay.
Yeah, and yeah, for the purposes of this guide, this is particularly with the use of non-medical cannabis. I think that's a great question, but not something that we do sort of a dive into in terms of those particular issues within the guide.
Yep. So let me see if I have any other questions. Okay. I think that's all the questions that we have. We'll see if anything else comes up. But yeah.
One of the other things that I just wanted to mention, and it'll be clear in the guide, is that we would love to hear back from you in terms of the guide, in terms of what we've put in the guide. And as has been stressed during today's webinar, we see it as a living document. So please check in. As other resources are developed, they will be found in the toolkit as well. And we really see it as a go-to place for people who are looking for information. And just a plug to those of you that might be new to the center, our website is also a great clearinghouse for other documents that you might be looking for in terms of campus mental health. So please have a look at our resources section, because there might be answers to other questions that you may be having as well. So thank you.
I could just make one comment as well. I think just the importance of engaging students in the development of campus policies and approaches and messaging with respect to cannabis. I imagine, Dominica, you can speak to this, and I know CICMH has really taken an active approach in terms of engaging campus professionals with respect to the survey to inform this resource. But I think that's something that we really want to underscore, making sure that any type of health education messages, harm reduction messages are really engaged, students are engaged in terms of tailoring and making sure that they are most impactful.
Yep. So we actually had two more questions just quickly crop up. One is, are there any institutions currently thinking of a campus lounge? I'm not sure what a campus lounge is, but perhaps a place on campus where you can smoke cannabis. I'm not sure. So whoever who asked that question, if you could clarify. Then the next question is, do we anticipate confusion between medical and recreational use, seeing as cannabis stores are now technically medicinal in the sense that there may be more requests for accommodations?
Seeing as cannabis stores are now technically medicinal. There's a little bit of confusion in that for me, but I will say that the two systems, the recreational system and the medical system, are going to remain separate. And currently, with medical cannabis, sales are only online, and with the recreational system, there is going to be both storefronts and also online sales as well. I don't know, Tamar, is there anything that you wanted to sort of jump in with that? There's a bit of confusion for me with the question itself.
Yeah, I think it's just too important to delineate. They're two separate, completely separate systems. I mean, medical cannabis and recreational cannabis is cannabis, but the purpose and the authorization of medical cannabis compared to the access of non-medical cannabis through the stores are going to be different. But I realize that might cause some confusion at a campus level if you're not aware of student X versus student Y is using it recreational versus medically. So I can understand the confusion from the person who commented.
Thank you. Yes, with respect to the campus lounge, that was a place to smoke cannabis on campus. And we actually had somebody reply to that at Carleton. They're advised that they cannot create specific places on campus for recreational use of cannabis. Yeah. So I do not know of any other campuses where there might be recreational spaces to smoke cannabis on campus. Maria?
I haven't heard any. Again, we can put that question out to our partners on campuses across the province.
From the university's perspective, this issue has come up, and again, by law, you can only consume within a legal private residence, and a lounge is not a private residence. There was discussion about perhaps asking the government to, at some point, look at the creation of lounges. And I know, in our discussions with the Attorney General and Maisy and others, that's, while I don't think that will happen in the first couple months of legalization, it is not completely off the table. So I think, not right away, but it is something that campuses will need to consider at some point.
Yeah. Okay, so I think we have time for one last question, and actually it's a really good question because it's something that we've been going back and forth with quite a bit. For the lower risk alcohol use guidelines, there are specific limits and suggestions of number of drink, and context is also factored in. Whereas for the cannabis guidelines presented today, they're a bit more vague. Is that by design? Should we have more concrete suggestions / policies regarding the amount of consumption? So it's something that we've been talking quite a bit about.
Jean, how about I take a stab at the new fill-in?
Yeah, sure.
So I think that's a very important point and great question. As everyone should know, the LR, the lower risk alcohol drinking guidelines, provide specific amounts of alcohol that men and women can drink in a sitting and over the course of a week. The challenge with cannabis is you can't make an equivalent amount of like a glass of beer, a glass of wine. So the modes of consumption of cannabis are through inhalation, depending on the depth of breath, depending on the concentration of THC, this greatly varies. One of the recommendations in the LRCUGs is to avoid deep breath holding, which is a real, it's an example of increasing, that some people will use to increase the physical effects of cannabis. So with that respect, the nature of the mode of consumption prevents the ability for guidelines to say X number of whatever. So recognizing it is a challenge. So what the LRCUGs are a harm reduction tool that provide guidance to individuals who are recommended not to use cannabis, and the situations and scenarios in which cannabis should be avoided. So they are very different tools, but at their essence, they're both harm reduction tools that are intended to promote that mental health and well-being of the population.
Great. Yeah, nothing to add. I think
It's a perfect explanation.
Yeah, Tamar, you nailed it. Yeah.
Great. Well, I think that was like basically a perfect way to end the webinar, actually. So thank you so much, all of you, for presenting with us today. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. So as mentioned earlier, we do have an online community of practice going. It's hosted on EENet, and this is a place where our webinar participants can continue to ask questions, post discussions, and network with other people in the sector. So in the follow-up email that I'm going to be sending out tomorrow, it's going to contain a link to our community of practice. So I would encourage people to sign up and join in. This is also our last webinar for the season. We're going to be taking a break over the summer, but we will be back with more in September. So please subscribe to our newsletter for continued updates. And don't forget the survey that's going to pop up at the end of the webinar. Thank you, everyone, and thank you to the team.
Thank you.